Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Book Bites. I'm your host Layla, and today we're diving deep into one of the most thought-provoking books we've explored yet, Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Loewen. This book is a real eye-opener, pulling back the curtain on the myths, omissions, and distortions that shape the way we learn American history. As usual, we're breaking it down into bite-sized segments so you can get the full impact without feeling overwhelmed. So grab your favorite snack, settle in, and let's take a critical look at the stories we've been told in school and what we've been missing. You won't want to miss this. Let's get started. The problem with textbooks. Loewen begins by highlighting the pervasive issue with history textbooks in America. According to him, these textbooks are often filled with inaccuracies, oversimplifications, and omissions. This is not necessarily because the authors or publishers intend to mislead students, but because the textbooks are designed with a specific agenda in mind, one that is shaped by corporate interests, political pressures, and the desire to create a palatable, sanitized version of the past that will not offend or upset anyone. Loewen argues that many textbooks avoid discussing controversial topics or difficult historical truths because they fear that touching on these issues will cause discomfort or backlash from certain groups. For example, textbooks often gloss over the brutality of slavery or the complexity of Native American history, reducing these issues to a few sentences or paragraphs that fail to convey the full scope of their significance. Instead of presenting a nuanced view of American history, textbooks tend to offer a feel-good version that leaves students with a distorted understanding of the past. Loewen also points out that the narratives presented in textbooks often favor the perspective of the dominant group in American society, the white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant majority, while downplaying or ignoring the experiences of marginalized groups such as African Americans, Native Americans, and other racial or ethnic minorities. This omission of minority perspectives leads to a skewed understanding of history that perpetuates stereotypes and reinforces social inequalities. The heroification of historical figures. One of the most significant issues Loewen addresses is the heroification of historical figures. In American history textbooks, figures like Christopher Columbus, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson are often presented as flawless heroes who played an essential role in shaping the nation. While it's true that these individuals made significant contributions, Loewen argues that the way they are portrayed in textbooks tends to whitewash their flaws and ignore their less savory actions. For example, Columbus is often presented as a brave explorer who discovered the Americas, when, in reality, his voyages led to the exploitation and death of indigenous populations. Similarly, George Washington is revered as the father of the nation for his leadership in the American Revolution and his role in founding the United States. But his ownership of slaves and his involvement in the displacement of Native Americans are rarely addressed in detail. Loewen argues that this tendency to portray historical figures as heroes can have damaging effects. By omitting or downplaying the negative aspects of their lives and actions, textbooks create a distorted image of the past, one that fails to capture the complexities of history. This oversimplification also reinforces the idea that history is about individual heroes, rather than collective struggles or systemic issues. The focus on individual achievements often leaves little room for understanding the broader social, political, and economic forces that shaped historical events. The impact of historical distortion on students. So, what are the consequences of these distortions in history education? According to Loewen, the impact is far-reaching. When students are taught a sanitized, oversimplified version of history, they are not given the tools to think critically about the world around them. Instead of learning about the complexities and contradictions of the past, they are presented with a version of history that makes them feel good, but does not challenge their preconceived notions or encourage them to question the status quo. Loewen argues that this lack of critical engagement with history has profound implications for American society. Without a thorough understanding of the past, students are less likely to recognize the social injustices and inequalities that continue to shape the present. Furthermore, the distortion of history fosters a sense of nationalism and exceptionalism, in which Americans believe that their country is inherently virtuous and free from the flaws that have plagued other nations. This can lead to a dangerous sense of complacency and an unwillingness to address the ongoing issues of racism, inequality, and injustice that persist in the United States. In essence, Loewen argues that history education plays a crucial role in shaping the values and beliefs of future generations. By presenting a more accurate, nuanced, and inclusive view of the past, we can help students develop a more critical and thoughtful approach to the world around them. Revising the narrative. What needs to change? In the book, Loewen advocates for a major overhaul of the way history is taught in American schools. He calls for a more inclusive curriculum that acknowledges the contributions of marginalized groups and addresses the difficult aspects of American history. This includes not only a more accurate portrayal of figures like Columbus, Washington, and Jefferson, but also a deeper exploration of the experiences of enslaved people, Native Americans, women, and other marginalized groups who have been left out of the traditional narrative. Loewen also suggests that history education should focus more on the social, political, and economic forces that shape historical events, rather than just presenting a list of dates and facts. By examining the broader context in which events occurred, students can gain a better understanding of the complexities of history and how the past continues to influence the present. One of the key ideas Loewen introduces is the concept of historical thinking, which involves questioning the sources of historical information, analyzing different perspectives, and considering the motivations behind historical narratives. By teaching students to think critically about history, we can help them develop the skills they need to be active, engaged citizens who are capable of addressing the challenges of the future. The myth of Christopher Columbus, the discoverer of America. One of the most famous examples Loewen explores is the myth of Christopher Columbus. For generations, American schoolchildren have been taught that Columbus discovered America in 1492. However, Loewen argues that this myth is not only historically inaccurate, but also problematic because it ignores the existence of indigenous peoples who had been living in the Americas for thousands of years before Columbus's arrival. Columbus's voyages are often portrayed as a noble endeavor that opened the door to European exploration and colonization. Yet, Loewen points out that Columbus's encounters with the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean were marked by violence, exploitation, and the beginning of a brutal colonization process. Columbus and his men enslaved, mistreated, and killed many of the native populations they encountered, and this aspect of his legacy is rarely discussed in mainstream textbooks. The myth of Columbus as a heroic figure who discovered America, Loewen argues, is part of a larger pattern of historical heroification in which complex, morally ambiguous figures are sanitized and celebrated. By presenting Columbus as a hero, textbooks obscure the darker aspects of the history of European colonization, which resulted in the destruction of entire indigenous cultures and civilizations. In Loewen's view, it's crucial to teach students about Columbus's legacy in a more nuanced way. Instead of simply focusing on the idea of discovery, we should also discuss the devastating consequences of European colonization for indigenous peoples. This shift in perspective would allow students to engage more critically with the past and recognize the importance of indigenous history in the larger narrative of the Americas. The myth of the Founding Fathers and the American Revolution. Another historical myth Loewen tackles is the idealized portrayal of the Founding Fathers and the American Revolution. Figures like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin are often presented in textbooks as flawless heroes who fought for freedom and democracy. While these men undoubtedly played pivotal roles in the founding of the United States, Loewen argues that their actions are frequently stripped of their complexities and contradictions. For example, while Jefferson is often celebrated for his role in writing the Declaration of Independence and advocating for democratic principles, his status as a slave owner is rarely addressed in depth. Washington, likewise, is revered for leading the Continental Army to victory in the Revolutionary War, but his own slave-holding practices are frequently downplayed. These omissions are not accidental. Loewen suggests that the historical narrative around the Founding Fathers has been constructed in such a way as to maintain their status as heroic, untouchable figures. Loewen also criticizes the way the American Revolution itself is often presented. In textbooks, the revolution is depicted as a straightforward struggle for liberty against the tyranny of British rule. However, Loewen points out that the revolution was far more complicated. For one, it wasn't a unanimous movement for freedom. Many colonists, particularly those in the southern colonies, were motivated by economic interests, such as the preservation of slavery, rather than a desire for democratic ideals. Additionally, the revolution didn't necessarily lead to a more democratic society for everyone. For African Americans, women, and Native Americans, life under the new republic was often little better than before the revolution. By presenting the American Revolution as a clean-cut battle for freedom, textbooks erase the contradictions and struggles within the revolution itself. This distortion of the past, Loewen argues, prevents students from understanding the true motivations behind the revolution and the ways in which it both advanced and hindered various groups' rights. The myth of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Another significant area Loewen tackles in Lies. My teacher told me is the distortion of the Civil War and the Reconstruction period that followed. Many American history textbooks present the Civil War as a conflict primarily over states' rights, downplaying the central role of slavery in causing the war. According to Loewen, this oversimplification of the war's causes is a deliberate attempt to avoid confronting the country's history of racism and the brutal system of slavery that was at the heart of the conflict. By reducing the Civil War to a battle over states' rights, textbooks obscure the fact that Southern states seceded from the Union largely to preserve the institution of slavery. Loewen argues that this myth of states' rights is not only inaccurate, but also dangerous, as it perpetuates a false narrative about the causes of the war and distracts from the ongoing legacy of slavery and racism in America. Loewen also critiques the way textbooks treat the Reconstruction period, which followed the Civil War. After the Union won the war, the Reconstruction era aimed to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved African Americans into society as equals. However, Reconstruction was met with fierce resistance from white Southerners, and many of the gains made during this period, such as the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which granted African American citizenship and voting rights, were rolled back by the end of the 19th century. In textbooks, however, Reconstruction is often portrayed as a failed experiment, with little attention paid to the violent backlash and systemic racism that undermined the progress made during this time. Loewen argues that this misrepresentation contributes to the persistent myth that African Americans were incapable of governing themselves or fully participating in democracy, a stereotype that continues to shape racial attitudes today. The myth of the happy slave and the idealization of the South. In addition to these well-known historical myths, Loewen also addresses the more subtle distortions that occur when textbooks discuss the history of slavery in the United States. One of the most insidious myths Loewen critiques is the portrayal of enslaved people as happy and content in their conditions. This myth often emerges in the context of discussions about the antebellum South, where textbooks may present slavery as a benign institution that provided food, shelter, and work to African Americans, while ignoring the immense brutality and dehumanization that accompanied it. Loewen argues that this happy slave myth serves to justify and downplay the horrors of slavery, presenting it as a natural and benign part of Southern society. By sanitizing the reality of slavery, textbooks obscure the violent exploitation of African Americans and the ways in which slavery shaped the nation's economy, culture, and social systems. This myth also contributes to the larger narrative of Southern nostalgia, in which the South is idealized as a region of charm, hospitality, and simple values, even as it was built on the forced labor of enslaved people. Loewen contends that this romanticized view of the South contributes to the perpetuation of racial stereotypes and obscures the full history of slavery and its lasting effects on American society. The consequences of a distorted history. Education. One of the most powerful arguments Loewen makes in Lies. My teacher told me is that the distorted history presented in American classrooms has far-reaching consequences, not just for how we understand the past, but for how we engage with the present and shape the future. The myths and oversimplifications that pervade textbooks and curricula don't just affect students' academic knowledge, they also influence their attitudes, beliefs, and actions as citizens. Loewen argues that when students are taught a sanitized, idealized version of history, they are robbed of the tools needed to critically engage with the world around them. This lack of critical thinking prevents them from understanding the complexities of social, political, and economic systems, and it makes them less likely to challenge injustice or question established power structures. In short, a distorted history education creates a generation of students who are less equipped to be active, informed participants in democracy. The erosion of civic engagement. One of the key consequences Loewen highlights is the erosion of civic engagement in American society. By presenting history in a way that oversimplifies the past and glosses over important issues like racism, inequality, and exploitation, history education fosters a sense of complacency rather than one of active involvement in the world. Students are taught that the past is simply a list of dates, names, and events that have little bearing on their everyday lives. This makes it easier for them to ignore ongoing social issues, such as racial inequality, poverty, and environmental degradation, because they don't see how these issues are connected to historical processes. Moreover, Loewen contends that the lack of critical engagement with history leads to a sense of national exceptionalism, where students are taught to believe that the United States is inherently virtuous and that its history is one of constant progress and improvement. This myth of American exceptionalism reinforces the idea that the U.S. is above reproach, creating a dangerous narrative that ignores the country's failures and injustices. By failing to confront the darker aspects of American history, such as slavery, segregation, and the mistreatment of indigenous peoples, students are denied the opportunity to learn from past mistakes and work toward a more just society. The perpetuation of inequality. Loewen also discusses the role that distorted history plays in perpetuating inequality. In his analysis, he argues that the myths taught in schools reinforce existing social hierarchies, particularly in terms of race and class. When students are taught that American history is a story of triumph and greatness, they are less likely to recognize the ways in which racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination have been built into the fabric of American society. For example, Loewen highlights how textbooks often present slavery as a benign institution that was beneficial to both slaves and slaveholders, or they present the civil rights movement as a struggle between good and evil, where the heroes were just fighting for freedom. This oversimplification of the past makes it harder for students to understand the systemic nature of racial inequality and its enduring impact on American society. By failing to teach students about the historical roots of racial discrimination and the long-lasting effects of policies like redlining, voter suppression, and mass incarceration, history education reinforces the idea that racism is a problem of individual behavior rather than a structural issue that needs to be addressed. Loewen also argues that the portrayal of indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups as passive victims, rather than active agents in their own histories, contributes to the erasure of their struggles and achievements. This distortion of history leaves students with a skewed understanding of power dynamics, preventing them from recognizing the ways in which inequality is perpetuated by both historical narratives and contemporary systems. The call for reform in history. Education. Given the consequences of a distorted history education, Loewen makes a compelling case for the need to reform how history is taught in American schools. He doesn't just criticize the flaws in textbooks and curricula. He offers concrete suggestions for how to improve the teaching of history and make it more inclusive, accurate, and meaningful for students. Loewen's primary recommendation is for schools to move away from the traditional, textbook-driven approach to history and adopt a more dynamic, critical method of teaching. This involves encouraging students to engage with history as a process of inquiry rather than as a collection of facts to be memorized. Instead of simply learning about dates and events, students should be encouraged to ask questions about the past and consider multiple perspectives on historical events. This approach would help students develop a deeper understanding of history and its relevance to their lives. Emphasizing multiple perspectives. One of the key aspects of Loewen's reform plan is the inclusion of multiple perspectives in the history curriculum. Rather than focusing solely on the viewpoints of white, male, European-descended individuals, history education should incorporate the experiences of marginalized groups such as African Americans, Native Americans, women, and working-class people. This includes teaching about the history of slavery, the struggle for civil rights, the impact of colonialism, and the role of indigenous peoples in shaping American history. Loewen also suggests that history teachers should encourage students to examine the motivations behind historical events and the ways in which power structures shape historical narratives. By analyzing history from a more critical perspective, students can begin to understand the forces that drive change and the ways in which individuals and groups struggle for justice and equality. Moving beyond the great men narrative. Another important aspect of Loewen's vision for history reform is moving away from the great men narrative that dominates traditional history textbooks. Instead of focusing solely on individual heroes like Columbus, Washington, and Lincoln, Loewen advocates for a more collective approach to history that examines the contributions of everyday people, social movements, and grassroots organizations. By highlighting the role of ordinary people in shaping history, students can gain a more nuanced understanding of how societies evolve and how change occurs. Loewen also suggests that history education should focus more on the broader social, economic, and political context in which events take place. Rather than presenting history as a series of isolated events or individual actions, students should be encouraged to think about the larger forces, such as capitalism, imperialism, and racial inequality, that shape historical outcomes, encouraging historical thinking and critical inquiry. Finally, Loewen emphasizes the importance of teaching students to think historically. This means not just memorizing facts, but developing skills in critical thinking, analysis, and interpretation. Loewen encourages teachers to use primary sources, encourage debate and discussion, and foster an environment where students can question what they are being taught. By developing these skills, students can learn to think critically about the past and its relevance to the present. In essence, Loewen's call for reform in history education is a call for a more honest, inclusive, and critical approach to teaching the past. By confronting the myths and distortions that have shaped American history, we can help students develop a deeper understanding of the complexities of history and the ways in which it continues to shape our world today. Conclusion: the power of history. To conclude our discussion of lies, my teacher told me Loewen leaves us with an important message. History is not just a collection of facts and dates. It is a tool for understanding the present and shaping the future. The way we teach history has a profound impact on how we view the world and our place in it. By challenging the myths and distortions in traditional history education, we can create a more informed, engaged, and thoughtful citizenry, one that is better equipped to address the challenges of the future. As Loewen argues, history is not just a series of events that happened in the past. It is a living, breathing force that continues to shape our lives today. By teaching history in a more honest and inclusive way, we can help students develop the critical thinking skills they need to engage with the world around them and work toward a more just and equitable society. All right, that's a wrap for today's episode of Book Bites. We've explored the myths and distortions that shape American history in Lies My Teacher Told Me. But there's so much more to dive into. If you found today's discussion eye-opening, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Also, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the book and the topics we covered. What history myths did you learn in school? Drop your comments below and let's get the conversation going. Until next time, I'm Layla, and this has been another bite-sized exploration of the books that challenge the way we think. Keep reading, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next episode of Book Bites.